Hi, today we're going to talk about getting started with React and TypeScript. First things first, before we start, it's worth installing Node.js and installing Visual Studio Code. You'll find both of these on the internet fairly easily. Once that's done, I recommend you type this command here, which will get us started with a basic starter framework of React with TypeScript installed. I suggest you do it now, and so while I get on the rest of the video, it will be done once I get to the part where we actually get our hands into the code. Now, let's talk about three things. Why React? Why do we want to learn React? What's the point of learning React? How does React work on a very basic level? Kind of framework of how it works, and then we'll start getting our hands into the muck, into the code, seeing in practice how we can get a simple application going, how components work, how we can set up components to use state and to use properties that are passed down to them. So first, why React? Two reasons. React is fun and React is simple. Now, what do we mean when we say that React is fun? Well, two things. Once again, it's fun because it has a short feedback loop. The time between when you code something and when you see the result is short. It updates automatically, which means that it's fun to get the result straight away of what you're doing and see what you're doing, and that creates a fun moment. The other thing, which is kind of similar, is it's also fun for users to access. What I mean by that is, contrary to a normal web page, like old style PHP, HTML, when you change the page, the browser calls the server who sends down a new page. So you switch pages and there's kind of a flick as you change pages. Now, React does things slightly differently. What happens is, when you connect, the browser downloads the code for the application from the server and shows the first page. And then when we change pages, it actually connects to the server but gets information and then does the change locally. This means that there's no flicker. It also means that we can change things on the page without actually changing pages. We can update the logic and take into account the player's actions without breaking the user experience. So React is fun because it's fun to develop in and it's fun for the user to use. Now, second point, React is simple. What do we mean by that? React does one thing and it does it well. Let's look at how it works to see how simple it is. First, what we do and what React does and what the developer does is break the page down into components. That is to say, for example, the header, the sidebar, the main content, the footer, that kind of stuff. Now, once that page is broken down into components, each component can contain other components. The page itself is actually a component. And so we start by breaking the page down into components, and each component then contains other components. What is a component? A component is a function that simply returns HTML-ish code, and as we can see, other components inside that HTML-ish code. Right, so that's it. It's not that complicated. If you've done the install, we can look now together at how the code works, and let's take a dive in as a first step of starting to build our React application using TypeScript. So, as they used to say on Blue Peter, here's one I made earlier. I've executed the command, and let's get into it. The first thing you see here, it says you can start the application by going into the directory, which I've just done, and then executing yarn start. You can also do npm run start. So let's do that now. Npm run start, and this is going to start a browser. So the browser has been started and we have the application going here. We're going to execute Visual Studio Code here in the same directory. It's going to open up. Right, and as you can see, I've just opened up Visual Studio Code, and underneath I have here here, wherever, the React application that's been started, and we have the console underneath. And if you look, the React application says edit app.tsx to and save to be able to reload. This is actually the code that we have here. I've opened app.tsx and we have the edit app.tsx and save to reload. And save to restart. So if I just do that, and it's going to auto save. So this is actually going to compile. There we see it compiling now. And once it's finished compiling, the page is going to reload, if all goes well. And there we have it. And save to restart. As I mentioned earlier, the component is a function, and it simply returns this content here. Now this content here looks a lot like HTML. It's not quite HTML, but it's similar, very similar to HTML. I'll just bring this down here. There are two major differences. Here we can see is actually, instead of calling classes in the HTML, it's adding class names. Now the reason for that is that class is actually a reserved keyword in JavaScript and in TypeScript, so we can't use it here. So we use class name to define an HTML class. The second point here is we're including here with these curly brackets notation a file which has been included up here, which is actually an SVG file. SVG files are actually graphical files, but they're text files. So we can actually include it directly. We say import the file and include it here. It's actually going to import the SVG directly. And this notation here with the two brackets is important because we're going to be using it again. And we're going to be using it again right now, in fact, because we're really going to be looking at how to pass properties into the function. Basically, here we can just do props, and this is passing the parameter. It's not going to be too happy about this for the moment because for two reasons. One, we haven't actually defined a type for this property and we're not using it yet. First things first, let's start by creating a type. So we can do interface app props, and we'll have it empty for now, and we're going to say that the props are an app props. So that's going to solve part of the problem. Now, how do we use the props? Well, precisely with the curly brackets notation that we mentioned just a few seconds ago. Here, if I want to add a parameter, so param is a string, and then I want to have this here, I'm going to say do a line break, br, and then I'm going to do param equals props param. Now it's going to work partially, as i.e. it's going to be valid here. The problem is I've defined a parameter that is not defined when I call the application. I call the application here in index.tsx, and it's calling the app component, and here it's going to complain because there is no parameter defined in the type. And adding a parameter to a component is very similar to defining a property in HTML. We're just going to do param equals hi, and this is defining the parameter. We could here do a notation like this, param equals hi. At the moment, because it's just a static string, it's the same. Here, if we go back here, he's complaining because he's compiling, but it should be good. Here we have the parameter which is set here. So as we can see, it's updated, and the parameter that I've passed into the component has been used inside the React component. There is a different way of writing this here. We could actually do const app. It's a React functional component which has the props as app props, and it's equal to props fat arrow. So this notation is actually more precise in terms of what a component is, because here, by defining this as a functional component, this means that the props actually have a children parameter to them, which allows us to put content inside the HTML type tags, and that the children will be the content that's between the HTML tags. Now, how do we use, this is how we use properties. There's another interesting thing to use, which is the state, the internal state of the component. And the preferred way to do this now with React 16 is to use the useState hook. How this works is very simple. Once again, we define this as a constant. We say we want counter and set counter, and we want that to be equal to useState 0, and this is not defined yet because I haven't imported it from React. There we go. So now I've imported useState, and I have the counter and the set counter variables. Counter defines the current state, and set counter allows us to update the state, and this happens outside the render, so outside the function. And I can just set it here as br, and here we're going to go counter equals and counter. And so here, if we reload, counter equals 0. Now, how do we update the state? We're just going to create a button. We're going to go button, and the button is going to have a click me text inside, and we're just going to create a on. There we go. On click equals, and we're going to do set counter of counter plus 1. So we defined a on click method on the button, and that button method just takes the current value of the counter, increments it, and pushes that to the set counter function, which we define here with the hook. So if we click here, click, 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 we've updated the state from the click on the button. So that's a kind of a quick overview of how we can define parameters for a component and pass them down, and how we can define the state inside the component. And to a certain extent, that's almost all we need to know. There are more hooks that allow us to do kind of more interesting things, like get data from a server, or create a reaction to when parameters change, or that kind of stuff, or to initialize a variable on the first render of the component. But the core of React is there. It's components which contain other components. So for example, here I could define the button as being a component. Here we've actually, in the index, we have a component, which is actually, it's more of a kind of more complicated thing. Component. It's that kind of notation, which contains the component called app, which passes in a parameter. So anyway, that's a quick overview of how React works. If you've found this interesting, then please subscribe. Please leave a comment or a question, or please tell me how you're progressing, or what you're wanting to learn about React. I'll be happy to answer the questions, and we'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.